Hello everybody, and welcome back to the CB&Q in Wyoming Building Casper series. I'm Mark Pruitt, Chief Passenger Station Floor Mopper. In part 1 of planning the yard, we talked briefly about YouTube and internet resources for yard planning, key elements that I think I need to incorporate in the yard, and then we went over some of the design details of the yard itself, like the engine facility size, the number of local industries, and so on. In today's episode, we'll do a very brief recap of the key elements for my yard design, and then we'll go through in some detail how the yard has evolved from version 1 of the layout all the way up to version 5, the current version. We'll talk about the strengths of each of the designs, we'll go over the flaws in each of those designs, and we'll see if I learned anything over the many years that I've been model railroading and building versions of the CB&Q in Wyoming. So with that said, let's jump right in. To recap, here are the key elements I settled on to make Casper Yard successful. A functional classification yard, tracks of sufficient length for the trains that will be entering and departing the yard, a sufficient number of classification tracks to handle the quantity of trains expected, and a well-placed runaround track to allow the switcher to do its job effectively. A fully developed steam-centered engine terminal, 2 turntable leads for easy flow of motive power, a roundhouse sized to support the number of locomotives required for the traffic, a decently furnished, if compact, preparation area, and a small but serviceable ready track. A variety of different sized local industries to service. Several small industries, I round up with 7. Some large industries, I have 2. And finally, a limited length drill track or switch lead. Regarding the elements I purposely did not include, I figured the operators would be busy enough without those additional things to possibly worry about. I think operations will be exciting enough without diversions like bad order cars and train wrecks on the main line. Plus, maintenance of way tracks are most often just scenic elements as regarding operations, and I had better uses for the space. Well, enough of the analysis and theory. It's high time we moved on into the actual track planning for Casper Yard. We'll do so, as I said in the intro, by looking at how Casper Yard evolved over the 5 different CB&Q in Wyoming layouts I've built, and stepping, in order, through the key elements I just summarized. We're looking at the track plan for Casper from version 1 of the layout, which was under construction in my basement in Wenonah, New Jersey way back in 1997. While I built earlier layouts with Casper as the main yard, they were just named Casper, and very little thought went into them other than making sure I had some classification tracks and a bunch of other tracks that I would figure out what to do with later. The Wenonah layout was designed for a 15-car maximum train length. The classification tracks were sized accordingly. There were 7 tracks, with the longest able to hold, at capacity, 15 40-foot cars. The shortest, 6 cars. If filled to capacity, about 75 cars would fit in the classification yard. This version of Casper was a real spaghetti mill of tracks. Anywhere there was room, I put a track, and intentionally included some difficult switching. Included in the upper right area were the icing platform, on this version about 27 inches long and able to service about 8 cars on its 2 tracks. And on the far left, unlabeled, was the standard oil loading racks. The rack was planned to service a much more respectable 14 cars. Looking at each of the key elements I listed earlier, we find them all in this first version of Casper Yard. The classification yard is basically functional, although the tracks are a bit short. 7 tracks provide even more classification tracks than I have on the current version, which helps a tiny bit to offset the short length of the tracks. Even so, working the classification area would be a challenge because of the short length of the tail of the runaround, capable of handling maybe 4 cars plus the switcher. The engine service area fits the bill just fine. Decent sized roundhouse, More ample for this somewhat smaller layout than the current one, in fact, since the roundhouses have the same number of stalls, separate inbound and outbound tracks, and the tail of the outbound track serves as a larger ready track than I have now. A variety of local industries, including the same two major ones, the icing platform, which maybe should really be considered a medium industry at its 8-car capacity, and the oil loading racks, capable of handling 16 cars at once. Then there's the ubiquitous team track and several other sidings with industries that had not been identified. The switch lead is of limited length, though not as short as it looks, since the turnouts and tracks all the way down to the runaround track can be considered part of it, a total length of 12 cars plus switcher. I hadn't developed my switcher car capacity limits at that time. So it all sounds good, right? Now let's look at some of the flaws in this design. First, note the position of the classification area at an angle to the main line, that's the purple line, and well away from it, the passing siding, and the arrival departure track. While not a fatal flaw, certainly it isn't ideal. There are reasons almost all prototype yards are parallel to the main lines. Second, every move to and from the engine facility disrupts yard switching, as the road engines can only access the AD track via the switch lead. And making it worse, the team track is off the engine servicing lead, meaning switching the team track will also disrupt yard switching and at times engine moves as well. Finally, we get to the switching area to the left of the engine facility on the opposite side of the main line. The parallel tracks farthest to the left of the roundhouse are for the oil loading racks. Just to the right of them is a switchback puzzle, included just because it looked like it would be a challenge for operators. That is never a good idea. There are valid reasons for doing this in some locations, but to challenge operators isn't one of them. In summary, this plan, while serviceable, suffers from some significant flaws. None are fatal, but combined they would have made handling this yard more difficult than it needed to be. Certainly the enjoyability of operating the yard would have suffered because of these shortcomings. On a final note, it's interesting to note that this plan had more of the key elements than the current version 5 plan, in that it included a track for a wreck or maintenance of way train, a rip track, and a cleanout track. I hadn't yet learned that sometimes less is more. Now let's move on to Casper Yard version 2, on the most ambitious of all the layout versions, the first Cove Road layout back in the early 2000s. Did I make better use of the space than at Wenonah? Did I learn anything from the time I designed Wenonah about 4 years earlier? Here's version 2 of Casper. Certainly it's longer than version 1, 28 feet long versus 18.5 feet. While the new version of Casper Yard was about 89 square feet versus 111 square feet for the Wenonah plan, linear length trumps square footage in terms of effective yard design. Train length on this layout was planned to be 22 to 24 cars long plus locomotive, about a 13 feet long train. Rather than step through every element of the design again, let's just compare some of the metrics of this plan to the earlier Wenonah plan. Where Wenonah had 7 classification tracks, Cove Road 1 had only 6, but the tracks were much longer, ranging from 21 cars long to 13 cars long. Total capacity was about 101 40-foot cars. The engine service area is comparable to Wenonah's. Same size roundhouse at 11 stalls. In fact, this has been the same on all versions of the layout. Plus room for a few garden tracks, separate inbound and outbound tracks, and a coal and sand delivery and ash removal track. About the same number of smaller local industry tracks as Wenonah. Of the larger industries, the icing platform is a significant improvement with its ability to handle 22 reefers at one time. That's a full train and much more in keeping with the prototypical operation of the platform. The oil loading racks could handle about the same number as the Wenonah design, 16 cars at once. The switch lead was a step back from Wenonah's, with an ability to handle only about 8 cars plus switcher. However, for longer cuts, the lead to the clean-out and maintenance of way tracks could be used as a switch lead for the yard, allowing for 12 cars plus switcher. Improvements over the earlier Wenonah yard design included the larger icing platform, classification tracks parallel to the main line and longer, and loco moves to and from the engine facility do not disrupt yard switching. But this version of Casper Yard had its own set of flaws, including the lead track for the oil loading racks is shorter than the rack tracks, prompting multiple moves to fill and empty each track. And building a train on the arrival and departure track would require fouling either access to the loco facility or the main line. While the classification track has a larger capacity and longer tracks, it's roughly equivalent to Wenonah's classification tracks when you take into account the longer train lengths of this layout. I'm not going to do a comparative analysis for the version 3 of the layout in Allendale, South Carolina, because I didn't flesh out the details of the track plan in the Casper area. Conceptually, it would have held a somewhat larger classification area and had a few additional smaller industries, but the remainder would have been similar to Cove Road 1. So we'll move on to Cove Road 2. This is the layout that I began after retiring in 2018 and moving back to New Jersey. Unlike earlier versions of the layout, I started by building Casper Yard first. Train length on this layout was planned for a general maximum of 20 cars. This yard was similar to Cove 1 in most aspects. The engine facility was almost identical, but provisions were made for 5 garden tracks to complement the 11-stall roundhouse. The classification area was comprised of 5 tracks, ranging from a capacity of 21 cars down to 13 cars. Total capacity was 74 40-foot cars. Provisions were made so that with a little bit of rework, the classification tracks could be extended to add capacity of an additional 10 cars or so in total. There were no smaller industry locations provided on this design because of the climbing loop-back arrangement of the main line that I mentioned earlier. It took up the space that would have been allocated for those small industries. The icing platform expanded again to a capacity of about 26 cars. The oil loading racks also expanded to 22 cars. Though there was room for a mow or rip track and or a clean-out track behind the roundhouse, they were not included because they were not considered priorities for operations. The switch lead was now positioned where it could service the arrival and departure track and the classification yard without interfering with the main line or the engine servicing facility. It also took into account my yard switcher car limitations, but had room to be extended if that proved untenable. Once again, let's look at the improvements, this time over the Cove Road 1 design. First, access directly from the runaround track to the oil loading racks, with a tail track large enough to fill and empty a rack track in one move, though switcher car limits would prohibit that. The switch lead position is greatly improved, and an easy path for extension was included. Third, the oil loading racks can now handle a full train at one time. But this plan, like all the others, had flaws. The major ones included no smaller local industries. The AD track must now double as Casper's passing siding. And the climbing loopback main line eats up real estate that could be used for additional industries or service tracks. And finally, we come to version 5, the current layout in Casper. Since the Casper yard is the same one used in version 4 of the railroad and just moved in 3 pieces to the new location, it might seem that the analysis would be the same, but that isn't the case. The new track plan eliminated the climbing loop backtrack behind the yard and freed up space for some major improvements with only minor changes to the track work. Let's take a look. The classification yard arrangement and capacity remains unchanged, as does the possibility of extending the tracks to add capacity if needed. The engine facility also is unchanged. But note that the main line now curves around the roundhouse on the right, then heads off from Casper in that same direction to the right or west. Previously, it curved around behind the roundhouse and back along the wall behind the yard, finally curving 90 degrees to the left to follow the wall. This realignment made room to move the oil loading racks further right, in turn freeing up even more space for the addition of small industries and service tracks. There are now plans for 6 smaller industries, plus an unusual feature, a second ice house. That's not shown on the plan, but it will be adjacent to either Natrona Lumber or Wyoming concrete producers. So there will be ice moves from the off-platform ice house to the ice house adjacent to the platform. This was prototypical for Casper. The improvements over the Cove Road 2 design, the addition of 6 small industries plus the second ice house, room to add a repair-in-place/clean-out track in the future, and better scenic possibilities at the backdrop with the elimination of the climbing mainline at the back. But even so, there are still some flaws which I'll just have to live with. The arrival and departure track doubles as a passing track, and the arrival and departure track is only 16 cars long. With a typical maximum train length of 20 cars, this means some trains will extend onto the main line or the switch lead when completely assembled. Possible solution is to use the main line as a second arrival and departure track for longer trains, diverting other trains through the arrival and departure track as a secondary main line. One question remains. How did I come up with the track arrangement? I knew what all elements were to be included and their basic sizes. How did I arrange them into a plan? Why did the standard oil loading racks and not the icing platform wind up behind the roundhouse? And why are the smaller industries almost all at the back of the yard? Well, as the operator faces the yard, he's standing in what would be North Casper facing south. West is to his right. In the real Casper, the roundhouse is on the west end of the yard and the refinery with its oil loading racks are south and a bit further west of that. The icing platform was more centrally located between the east and west ends of the yard, but north of the classification tracks. Most other industries were on the south side of the yard, and that's more or less how the model yard is arranged, allowing for a good bit of modeler's license. Other than the icing platform being south of the classification tracks, I did a pretty good job laying out the model of Casper Yard to reflect the prototype. Clever of me, wasn't it? Truth be told, the model yard reflecting the prototype facilities arrangement as closely as it does is sheer coincidence. When I drew up the track plan, I was focused solely on fitting everything into the space available while ensuring a fairly smooth flow of traffic through the yard. Nothing else. And that's how Casper Yard has evolved over the years and the pros and cons of the various versions. Let me know what you think are the current yard's strengths and shortcomings, and whether you think the changes over the years were improvements or detriments in the comments below. Did I learn anything over all those years, or am I deluding myself? Tell me. In episode 4, we wrap up the planning of the yard by briefly discussing some of the track planning software options that are available, both for a cost and for free. We'll also talk about how I plan to test yard operations before I even have the rest of the layout connected through simulations on the yard itself. Thanks for sticking with me. The next episode of Building Casper will be out in just a couple of days. Meanwhile, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you in episode 4.